Hey everyone, welcome back to Evil Shadow. Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. In the dead silence of the night, when the world is asleep, there's a place where time stands still. A forgotten railway station called Crimson Hollow. Once bustling with life, it now sits abandoned, cloaked in darkness and mystery. Every year, as the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, whispers of an unearthly presence echo through the air. They say, if you listen carefully, you can hear the faint whistle of a train that hasn't existed for decades. The legend speaks of a train that pulls into this station at exactly 12 a.m. A train with no conductor, no destination, and passengers who don't belong to this world. But there's a warning that accompanies the tale. Never board the midnight train. For those who do, are never seen again. On a frigid New Year's Eve, four friends, Alex, Jordan, Mia, and Liam, decided to uncover the truth behind the legend. Fueled by curiosity and the thrill of the unknown, they made their way to Crimson Hollow. This place is creepy as hell. Are we really doing this? Alex whispered, his breath visible in the icy air. Mia smirked. We've come this far. Don't chicken out now. Liam laughed nervously. Relax, it's just a story. Ghost trains don't exist. As the clock neared midnight, the air grew heavy, suffocating. The wind seemed to whisper their names, and an unnatural chill swept through the station. Out of the fog, it emerged, a black, gleaming locomotive, its windows dark like endless voids. The train came to a halt, its doors creaking open. Inside, the faint glow of lanterns revealed passengers sitting unnervingly still. This can't be real, Jordan stammered, his voice barely audible. Mia's eyes widened. Do you see their faces? They're not alive. Alex let out a nervous laugh. This is some elaborate prank, right? But it wasn't a prank. The passengers were dressed in tattered clothes from eras long past, their hollow eyes staring straight ahead. Despite their growing fear, something compelled the friends to step aboard. Inside, the air was thick with decay and despair. The seats were worn and splintered, with strange symbols scratched into the wood. Whispers filled the car, though no one spoke. The train began to move, its wheels screeching against the rusted tracks. The friends tried to find a way out, but every door led them back to the same carriage. Panic set in as the whispers turned into anguished cries. Mia clutched Liam's arm. We're trapped. We can't get off. Liam's voice cracked. This isn't possible. This can't be happening. Suddenly, the passengers turned their heads, their lifeless eyes locking onto the friends. One by one, they began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. They're coming for us. Run! Jordan screamed, his voice echoing through the carriage. Desperation consumed Alex as he grabbed a lantern and swung it wildly, trying to keep the spectral figures at bay. But it was no use. The train's interior began to shift, the walls melting into a nightmarish swirl of shadows and faces. The friends realized the truth too late. They were now passengers on the midnight train, destined to ride its cursed tracks for eternity. To this day, Crimson Hollow remains deserted, its silence broken only by the mournful whistle of the midnight train. And every New Year's Eve, the legend grows, waiting for its next victims. So, if you ever find yourself near an abandoned railway station at midnight, beware. The midnight train is always on time. It was New Year's Eve, and the air was thick with excitement and frost. In a quiet town, an old legend lingered, a story about a ghostly train that appeared once a year at the abandoned Crimson Hollow station. Most dismissed it as a myth, but for Alex, Mia, Jordan, and Liam, It was a challenge too tempting to resist. Are we really doing this? Alex asked, gripping his flashlight tightly as they walked along the overgrown tracks. Mia smirked. Come on, Alex. Don't tell me you're scared. Jordan laughed nervously. It's just a story, right? Nothing's actually going to happen. But Liam, the skeptic of the group, wasn't so sure. We'll find out soon enough. The station loomed ahead, its crumbling structure shrouded in fog. The cold seemed to intensify as midnight approached. The friends huddled together on the platform, their breath visible in the icy air. Then it happened. The sound of a distant whistle pierced the silence, faint at first, but growing louder. The fog thickened, swirling like a living thing. Out of the haze, a black locomotive appeared, its exterior unnaturally polished, reflecting the moonlight. The train's arrival was eerily silent. No screeching brakes, no hiss of steam. It simply stopped, its doors sliding open as if inviting them in. The group exchanged uneasy glances. This is insane, Alex whispered, his voice trembling. Mia stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. We didn't come all this way to chicken out. Inside, the train was a time capsule from another era. Dusty seats lined the walls, their fabric torn and faded. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. Newspapers littered the floor, their headlines dated decades ago. Look at this, Jordan said, picking up a yellow ticket. This is from 1936. Mia ran her fingers over the back of a seat, her expression darkening. There's something carved here. No escape. The words sent a shiver through the group. Liam moved to another seat, finding similar messages etched into the wood. Turn back. We're watching. The train lurched forward suddenly, nearly throwing them off balance. The door slammed shut, locking them inside. Okay, this isn't funny anymore, Alex said, panic rising in his voice. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Mia's flashlight flickered as she turned to the others. I think we just boarded the midnight train. The windows revealed only darkness outside. No tracks, no trees, just an endless void. The passengers, who had appeared lifeless at first, began to stir. Their heads turned in unison, hollow eyes fixing on the group. Guys, Jordan whispered, backing up against the seat. They're moving. The passengers stood, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, with sunken cheeks and wide, unblinking eyes. They're coming toward us, Liam shouted. The group scrambled down the aisle, but the train seemed to stretch infinitely, each car identical to the last. The whispers began then, soft at first, like a breeze through the trees, but growing louder and more insistent. Welcome, stay with us, forever. Jordan tripped over a newspaper, his flashlight skidding across the floor. He picked it up and froze. The headline read, "For missing after boarding midnight train, names revealed." Beneath it were their names. Oh my God, he gasped. This isn't possible. The whispers grew deafening, and the passengers closed in. The friends huddled together, their breaths coming in short gasps. What do we do? Alex shouted. There's no way out. Mia screamed. The train shuddered violently, and the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the passengers' faces morphed into something grotesque. Jawless mouths gaping, eyes hollow pits of darkness. In a final, desperate act, Alex grabbed a lantern hanging from the wall and swung it wildly, the dim light casting flickering shadows. It wasn't enough. The passengers enveloped them, their icy hands reaching, pulling, dragging. The train whistle sounded again, and Crimson Hollow fell silent once more. To this day, the midnight train remains a mystery, a chilling tale whispered among the locals. They say the group's faces can now be seen in the train's windows, staring blankly into the night. waiting for the next curious souls to join them. The chill of New Year's Eve hung heavy in the air as Alex, Mia, Jordan, and Liam stood on the dilapidated platform of Crimson Hollow Station. The legend of the midnight train was their subject tonight, a ghostly locomotive that appeared at midnight every New Year's Eve, carrying passengers who were never seen again. Jordan glanced at his watch. 5 minutes to midnight. Are we sure we want to do this? Mia scoffed. Don't tell me you're scared. It's just an old ghost story. Liam squinted into the fog that seemed to thicken with every second. Then why does this place feel wrong? As the clock struck 12, the eerie sound of a whistle shattered the night. The friends froze as a sleek, black train emerged from the mist, its massive form impossibly silent as it came to a halt. The doors slid open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Mia stepped forward, her curiosity pulling her closer. We came here for answers. Let's see what's inside. Reluctantly, the others followed, stepping into the cold, stale air of the carriage. The train's interior was from another era. Dust and decay coated the faded seats, and the air carried a metallic tang. Old newspapers and tickets littered the floor, some so brittle they crumbled at the touch. Look at this, Jordan muttered, holding up a yellowed ticket. It says 1943. How is that possible? Alex ran his hand over his seat, frowning at the words carved into the wood. We're all doomed. The train jerked forward, throwing them off balance. The doors slammed shut, and the windows darkened, revealing no sign of the outside world. What's going on? Alex demanded, pounding on the locked doors. Before anyone could respond, the whispers began, low and unintelligible at first, then rising into chilling clarity. They're watching. Run if you can. Join us. The friends turned to see the passengers, motionless figures seated throughout the carriage. Their skin was pale and waxy, their heads slumped forward. But as the whispers grew louder, the figures began to stir. Mia gasped. They're moving. One by one, the passengers lifted their heads, revealing their faces. Each was frozen in an expression of terror, their eyes wide and lifeless. They're dead, Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the train began to change. The walls shimmered, showing flashes of horrific scenes. A man clutching his chest as he collapsed in his seat. A woman screaming as smoke filled the carriage. A child crying out as flames consumed the train. They're reliving their deaths, Mia realized, her voice barely audible. The realization hit like a thunderclap. These weren't just passengers. They were spirits, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments. The whispers turned into a cacophony of screams, and the passengers stood, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes locked onto the friends. Why are they looking at us? Jordan asked, backing away. Mia's face turned pale. Because we're next. The train's walls melted into darkness, and the friends saw reflections of themselves in the glass. Desperation etched on their faces. But their reflections didn't move as they did. Instead, they sat lifeless among the other passengers. No, Alex muttered, shaking his head. This isn't real. It can't be. The whispers became voices, distinct and cruel. You boarded the train. You belong to it now. Forever. Liam clawed at the doors, his screams echoing. Let us out, please. But the train didn't stop. It never stopped. The friends sat in silence as the truth sank in. They were no longer the curious thrill seekers who had boarded the midnight train. They were passengers now, part of the legend, doomed to relive this night for eternity. And as the train's whistle pierced the air, the darkness outside the windows began to shift, revealing a new station. The doors creaked open, and faint voices could be heard from the platform beyond. A group of silhouettes emerged from the fog, curious souls drawn to the legend, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The friends tried to scream a warning, but no sound escaped their lips. They could only watch as the new victims stepped aboard, the train's eternal cycle beginning once more. Years passed, and the legend of the midnight train faded into whispers, dismissed by the locals as just another ghost story. But for one man, it wasn't a tale. It was a nightmare he could never escape. His name was James. He was the only one who had managed to escape the train's cursed grip. The others? They were still lost, trapped in the eternal journey, passengers among the spirits who would never rest. James could still remember the faces of his friends, their eyes filled with terror as the train's walls closed in on them. He could still hear their screams, their desperate cries for help, cries that would never reach anyone. He tried to warn the world, told everyone he met about the midnight train, about the horrors that awaited those who dared to board it. But they just laughed, dismissed him as crazy. "You're out of your mind," they'd say. "Ghost trains aren't real. It's just a myth." The doctors called it trauma, a symptom of the horrors he'd witnessed. They said he was delusional, a broken man who had imagined it all. But James knew the truth. He knew that the midnight train still haunted the tracks, still waited for its next victims. He could feel it every night in the stillness of the air, the faint whistle in the distance, the oppressive weight of something watching. One fateful night, when the moon was hidden behind clouds, James found himself standing at the edge of Crimson Hollow Station once more. He couldn't help it. Something drew him back. He had to make them believe, had to warn them. The train was coming. As the clock struck midnight, the whistle sounded, cutting through the silence like a blade. James' heart raced as he saw the gleaming black locomotive emerge from the fog, its windows dark and empty. The air grew colder, the whispers of the passengers rising on the wind. He stepped forward, his breath visible in the air. "Don't do it," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Get away from the train. It's not real. It's a trap." But the group of thrill-seekers behind him just stared, eyes wide with disbelief. They laughed, dismissing him as a madman, just as everyone else had. "Come on, old man," one of them sneered. "It's just a train. Get out of the way." James' heart sank. He couldn't stop them. He knew what would happen. He had lived it. The doors of the midnight train creaked open, inviting the unsuspecting souls aboard. The whispers turned into laughter, the kind that chilled the soul, as the passengers inside began to stir. James watched in horror as the group, oblivious to the danger, stepped aboard. He reached out, but it was too late. The doors slammed shut, and the train began to move. The whistle sounded again, and James knew that, once more, the midnight train was beginning its eternal journey. In the heart of a quiet town stood a forest, known only to the locals as the Whispering Woods. It was a place that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a place where the wind whispered through the trees in a language no one could understand. Travelers often spoke of hearing voices calling their names, beckoning them deeper into the woods, and many who ventured into its depths were never seen again. The elders spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who would listen to stay away. But like all legends, there were those who didn't heed the warnings. One such person was Clara, a young woman eager for adventure, who had heard the stories but dismissed them as mere superstition. "I'm not afraid," she said, laughing as she packed a bag for her journey. "It's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen?" Her friends, Emma and Lucas, exchanged uneasy glances. "Clara, you know the stories," Emma said. "People go in there, and they don't come back." Clara waved her hand dismissively. "It's just an old tale. You're both being paranoid." As the sun began to set, Clara made her way toward the edge of the Whispering Woods. The trees stood tall and imposing, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness as she stepped beneath the canopy, the world around her falling into an eerie silence. It didn't take long for her to hear it, the faintest whisper, barely audible at first. "Clara, Clara, come closer." She froze, her heart racing. The voice was so soft, so inviting. It sounded so familiar, as though it was calling to her from the depths of her own mind. "Hello," Clara called out nervously, stepping deeper into the woods. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Clara, come to us." She hesitated, fear creeping up her spine, but her curiosity won out. She pressed forward, following the sound of the whispers as they echoed around her. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting and shifting with an unnatural life of their own. The deeper she ventured, the more intense the whispers became. It was as though the very forest itself was alive, pulling her towards something she couldn't yet understand. Suddenly, she stopped in her tracks. The woods were too quiet now. The whispers had stopped. The air was still, like a thick fog pressing against her chest. A shadow flitted between the trees, too fast for her to catch. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness. But there was nothing there. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone or something was walking just behind her. Clara turned, heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in the darkness just beyond the reach of her flashlight, was a figure. A man. He was tall, with pale skin and hollow eyes that seemed to glimmer in the shadows. His mouth was twisted into a smile, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. "Come closer," he whispered, his voice low and hypnotic. Clara took a step back, a wave of unease washing over her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he was being controlled by something beyond his own will. His smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. It was predatory, hungry. Clara turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. She pushed through the underbrush, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out like claws, as though they were trying to hold her in place. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her ears. "Clara, you can't escape." She stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell to the ground, the world spinning around her. As she struggled to get up, she saw it, another figure emerging from the shadows. Then another and another. The forest was alive with movement. The figures were everywhere, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their smiles twisted and insane. "Clara," one of them whispered, "stay with us." The trees seemed to pulse with energy, the whispers growing into a chorus of voices, all calling her name. She could hear their laughter now, a low, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. Suddenly, everything went silent. The figures vanished, and the forest fell into stillness once more. Clara stood alone, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her? But as she turned to leave, a cold hand brushed against her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The whisper returned, this time more sinister than before. "You're one of us now, Clara, forever." The trees began to shift again, and Clara realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't alone. She had never truly been alone in the Whispering Woods, and now she never would be again. Ethan, a seasoned hiker, had heard the stories about the Whispering Woods his entire life. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious forest where travelers would hear voices calling their names, and many who entered were never seen again. But to Ethan, it was nothing more than superstition, a tale spun to scare children. He had hiked through countless forests, faced dangers on treacherous trails, and never once feared a thing. The mystery of the whispering woods intrigued him, and this New Year's Eve, he decided to uncover the truth for himself. As dusk fell, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the trees. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and the usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, were eerily absent. He shrugged off the unease creeping up his spine and adjusted his backpack. Just another hike, he muttered to himself. Nothing to be afraid of. He stepped into the woods, the crunch of dry leaves beneath his boots the only sound accompanying him. As he ventured deeper, the forest seemed to swallow the light, the trees growing taller and denser, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing step. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. "Ethan, Ethan." He stopped, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was distant, yet it seemed to draw him forward. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. The forest felt alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. "Just the wind," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "It's nothing." But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, coming from all directions. They were random sounds. They were words, his name, followed by phrases that made his stomach churn. "You're not alone, Ethan. We know you." Shivers ran down his spine. The forest seemed to close in, the trees looming like dark sentinels around him. Every step felt heavier, the ground beneath him shifting as if the earth itself were trying to hold him in place. He pushed forward, determined to silence the creeping dread that threatened to overtake him. But the whispers followed, growing clearer, more insistent. "We know your secrets, Ethan." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had never told anyone about his deepest fears, the memories he buried in the darkest corners of his mind. But now, it felt as though the very air around him was alive with them. His feet faltered, his mind whirling with confusion and fear. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and contort unnaturally, their forms shifting with an unsettling fluidity. Ethan's heart pounded as he turned, his senses heightened. It was then that he saw them. Figures, glimpses of pale faces and twisted bodies, emerging from the mist that had begun to settle around him. They were not human, at least not in the way he understood. Their forms flickered in and out of focus, like smoke caught in the wind. Their eyes, empty, hollow voids, stared back at him, and their faces twisted into expressions of mockery. "You cannot escape, Ethan." Ethan stumbled backward, his legs shaking as the figures moved toward him. He could hear their whispers now, not just in his ears but inside his mind, invading his thoughts with terrifying precision. They knew him. They knew everything about him, his past, his regrets, his darkest desires. One of the figures stepped closer, its face now clear in the mist. It was a woman, her skin pale as death, her eyes black as night. She smiled, a cruel, knowing smile, as her lips parted, and the air around her grew thick with a suffocating presence. "You can never leave, Ethan." Ethan's pulse raced. He turned to run, but the forest seemed to shift before his eyes. The trees twisted and moved, rearranging themselves, blocking his escape. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his head, filling his every thought with dread. "We are the forest, Ethan. We are your worst fears." The ground beneath his feet seemed to give way, and he stumbled forward, his foot catching on something unseen. His chest tightened as the shadows swirled around him, pulling him deeper into the mist. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to break free, but the figures were closing in. He could feel them now, cold, clammy hands brushing against his skin, their presence suffocating. The whispers were deafening, drowning out everything else. "You belong to us now, Ethan." Forever. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He was swallowed by the shadows, lost in the depths of the whispering woods, where no one would ever find him. And as the mist closed in around him, the last thing he heard was the echo of his own name, whispered over and over again until it became nothing but a distant, haunting sound. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as he stumbled through the mist, his lungs burning with each desperate breath. The shadows that had once seemed so distant were now closing in on him, stretching out like living tendrils, reaching for him with an unnatural, almost predatory grace. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were urging him to turn around, to face the darkness that was creeping ever closer. "Ethan, come closer." The voices called, each one more desperate than the last. He shook his head, trying to drown out the incessant whispers. The fear gnawed at his insides, the dread rising like a tidal wave. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee, to run back to the safety of the world he knew. But no matter which direction he turned, the shadows followed. The trees were bending and twisting, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal hands, closing in on him from all sides. "We know you, Ethan?" The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, insistent, pulling him further into the heart of the woods. He wanted to turn back, to escape, but it felt as if the very forest itself was alive, holding him captive. "You can't escape," the voice crooned, now laced with a dark, malicious edge. Ethan froze, his legs locking beneath him. He wasn't alone. The figures, the twisted, distorted shapes, were now standing before him, their hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. The first figure, the woman, was still there, her pale face twisted into a grotesque grin. But now, the others had joined her. More shapes, more figures, each one just as terrifying as the next, their faces contorted in agony. He felt a strange compulsion to move forward, to walk toward them. The air around him thickened, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though it were no longer solid. The whispers had become a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, all urging him to come closer. "Join us." His hands trembled as he reached out in front of him, his body moving of its own accord. His mind screamed for him to stop, to fight, but it was as if the forest had taken control, pulling him toward the figures. His feet felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the very earth itself. And then, the truth hit him like a blow to the chest. These weren't just shadows. They weren't just figments of his imagination. The figures were souls, tormented, trapped souls who had been lost to the forest, doomed to roam the woods for eternity. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the realization settled in. "You didn't listen, Ethan?" The woman spoke again, her voice now a soft, chilling whisper. "We were once like you, curious, brave, foolish." Her smile twisted further, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. "Now we are here, forever." As the shadows closed in, Ethan's mind raced. He had thought the whispers were just a trick of the wind, just a story meant to scare people away. But now he understood. The forest was alive, not with trees or animals, but with the souls of the lost, who had once wandered in like him, only to be trapped by the relentless pull of the whispers. The figures began to move, their eyes fixed on him, their hollow gazes never wavering. They reached out with skeletal hands, their fingers long and thin, their nails jagged and cracked. Ethan tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the power of the forest's grip. "We are all prisoners here," one of the figures said, its voice raspy and broken. "And you'll be too." Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling with fear. He could feel them now, cold, clammy hands brushing against his skin, pulling him closer. The whispers were deafening, filling his mind with terror. His world was spinning, the shadows closing in until there was nothing left but the deafening chorus of the souls that would soon claim him as one of their own. "Join us, Ethan." The figure of the woman stepped closer, her face so close that he could feel the coldness of her breath on his skin. Her eyes glistened with an unnatural light, the hunger for his soul burning in them. "You have no choice now," she whispered, her lips curling into a sadistic grin. "You are one of us." And then, with a sudden, violent jolt, Ethan felt himself being pulled into the shadows. His body was no longer his own, his limbs moving in unnatural jerks, as though he were being dragged through the woods by unseen hands. His screams were swallowed by the oppressive darkness, his cries unheard as the forest claimed another soul. The last thing he saw before he was lost to the mist was the twisted faces of the souls, their eyes glowing with malice, their voices whispering his name, beckoning him to join them in eternal torment. And so, Ethan became just another prisoner of the whispering woods, his name lost to the wind, his fate sealed forever. Ethan's heart pounded as he stumbled through the trees, the mist thickening around him, blurring his vision. His breath came in frantic gasps, his chest tightening with each step. The whispers still echoed in his ears, but they were fainter now, like distant memories fading into the night. With every ounce of strength left in him, he pushed forward, the forest finally beginning to thin as the edge of the woods came into view. His mind screamed to run, to escape, but his legs felt as though they were dragging through the thick, suffocating air. The shadows that had once been all around him were now retreating, but something lingered, something dark, something that refused to let go. As he broke free from the dense trees, he found himself standing at the edge of the forest, his eyes squinting against the dim light of the moon. The familiar sight of the path back to civilization greeted him. His car parked just a few hundred feet away. The cold night air cut through him, and he paused, gasping, his mind racing, his hands trembling. He was free, but when he turned to glance back at the forest, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something moved in the darkness, something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, impossibly dark, seemed to stretch from the trees like a living thing, following him even as he moved farther from the woods. His heart skipped a beat. No! Ethan's feet froze. His breath caught in his throat, and his body went rigid with fear. The shadow was no longer just in the woods. It was here with him. A shape, almost formless, flickered at the edge of his vision, its presence unmistakable. It was watching him. It was waiting. He whipped around to face the woods, his eyes scanning the darkness, but all he saw were the swaying trees, casting long, eerie shadows. He turned back to his car, but it felt wrong. His skin crawled, the air thick with the sensation of being watched. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself it was just his mind playing tricks. After all, he had escaped, right? There was nothing left to fear. But the feeling of dread clung to him like a second skin. As he reached his car and fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking uncontrollably, the shadow seemed to move closer. It was no longer just a faint shape. It was more defined, its edges sharp, its form dark and unnatural. He felt its presence closing in on him, like it was waiting for him to turn and face it. Ethan's breath became shallow, his pulse quickening. He couldn't escape it. It had followed him, and worse, it wanted him. He could feel it crawling under his skin, gripping his soul with icy fingers. His mind raced with the chilling realization. The woods had marked him. It was not over. Not yet. With a desperate motion, Ethan threw open the car door and slid into the seat, slamming it shut. His hands trembled as he started the engine, the roar of the car's motor filling the air. He glanced over at the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with terror. And there it was, a shadow, dark, formless, and watching, stood just outside the car, its shape flickering in and out of focus. It wasn't a physical being, not in the way that humans are. It was something darker, something that existed between the cracks of reality. A presence, a force, and it had followed him home. His pulse raced as he slammed his foot down on the accelerator, tearing away from the woods, the tires screeching against the pavement. But even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, the feeling of being hunted remained. The shadow, the thing from the woods, was still there, lurking in the corner of his mind, following him with every breath. He didn't know when it would come for him. He didn't know how. But one thing was certain. The whispering woods had not released him. It had only delayed the inevitable. Ethan's nightmares began that night, the shadow haunting him in every dark corner of his home, always watching, always waiting for him to slip, for him to make a mistake. And with each passing day, it grew stronger, more insistent, until one night, he would hear the whispers again, calling his name, pulling him back to the forest. And when that moment came, he would have nowhere left to hide. The moment the mirror was hung on the wall, everything changed. It was an antique piece, its ornate frame carved with intricate patterns, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of a time long past. An heirloom passed down through generations. The mirror had always been a symbol of the family's legacy. But the moment it entered the house, a chilling presence seemed to settle over the home. The air grew heavier, colder, as if something unseen had slipped through the cracks of time and into the present. At first it was subtle. The family, a mother, father, and their teenage daughter Mia, didn't think much of the oddities. A flicker of movement in the reflection that wasn't quite right. A feeling of being watched when no one else was around. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew more unsettling. Mia was the first to notice it. She would catch glimpses of figures in the mirror that weren't there in the room with her. Faces, pale, gaunt, and twisted, appeared in the reflection, staring back at her with eyes that seemed to burn with malice. The first few times, she thought it was her imagination. But as the images grew clearer, more persistent, she couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, while her parents were out, Mia stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. She had just gotten out of the shower and was preparing for bed, the house completely silent except for the soft hum of the old house settling. She caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a shadow, moving just beyond the edges of her reflection. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned quickly to look behind her, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. But when she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone, replaced by the same haunting face that had appeared before. Pale, thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to reach out to her. "Mia, are you okay?" Her mother's voice called from down the hallway, snapping her from the trance. Mia's breath was shallow, her hand trembling as she reached for the light switch. The eerie reflection faded the moment she turned away, but the feeling of being watched stayed with her, lingering in the corners of her mind. Over the next few days, the occurrences grew worse. Furniture would shift in the night, moved by an invisible force. The family would wake to find objects in the house inexplicably rearranged. The air was thick with unease, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One evening, Mia's mother, Sarah, stood before the mirror, adjusting a picture frame hanging nearby. As she looked into the glass, she saw a figure standing just behind her in the reflection. Her heart stopped as her eyes locked onto the image in the mirror. It was her, but it wasn't. The reflection seemed different. The eyes were vacant, the face gone, as though it were a hollow shell of the woman standing before it. The reflection's lips twisted into a cruel smile, one that Sarah hadn't made. She spun around, but the room was empty. The room grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of being surrounded by unseen eyes grew stronger. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. What was happening to them? What was it that the mirror was showing them? That night, the family gathered in the living room, tension thick in the air. The mirror had become a source of fear, an object that had turned their home into a place of dread. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the glass, waiting for the right moment to strike. They decided to investigate the mirror, searching through old family records for any clues about its origins. What they uncovered was far darker than they could have imagined. The mirror had once belonged to a distant relative, a woman named Isabella, who had died under mysterious circumstances. Legend had it that Isabella had been a part of a secretive, dark ritual meant to bind her soul to the mirror, trapping her in its reflection for eternity. The family had long since forgotten about Isabella and her sinister fate, but the mirror had not. As they uncovered the truth, the strange occurrences escalated. The family could no longer sleep through the night. Every time they looked into the mirror, the reflection seemed to grow darker, more twisted. Faces appeared, pale and emaciated, eyes filled with rage, staring back at them from the glass. The house felt colder, the shadows longer, as if the very walls were closing in. One night, as Sarah stood before the mirror, staring at the grotesque reflection that had become their reality, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She spun around in fear, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the oppressive silence. She turned back to the mirror, and for the first time, she saw Isabella's face, clear as day, staring back at her from the glass. Isabella's eyes were filled with anger, her mouth twisted into a snarl. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. The mirror wasn't just haunted, it was a prison. The spirits trapped within the glass were not just lingering, they were waiting for their freedom. They were waiting for the family to become part of their dark legacy. The mirror had claimed them all. In their final moments, Mia, Sarah, and her husband stared into the glass, their bodies frozen in place as the spirits, tortured souls bound to the mirror, reached out from the reflection. The last thing they felt was the cold, clammy touch of a hand that wasn't their own, dragging them into the mirror's eternal darkness. And the mirror, with its intricate designs and chilling presence, once again became just a piece of family history, a dark, cursed heirloom that would continue to haunt whoever dared to look into its depths. The first strange occurrence happened the very night the mirror was hung in the living room. Sarah, busy arranging the furniture, noticed something odd as she turned toward the mirror. For a split second, the reflection didn't match the reality of the room. The furniture seemed to be rearranged, the walls darker. But as quickly as it appeared, the reflection returned to normal. She brushed it off, attributing it to exhaustion. But that feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. The next morning, Mia walked past the mirror, yawning as she entered the hallway. She glanced into the reflection and froze. In the glass, there was a figure, a tall, shadowy shape that didn't belong in the room. She turned to look behind her, but the hallway was empty. Her heart raced as she looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. Days passed, and the strange occurrences became more frequent. The mirror began showing reflections of people who weren't there. Shadows flickered in the corner of their eyes, figures standing just out of view, always watching but never moving. At first, it was just a trick of the light, they thought, but as the days wore on, the images grew clearer. The faces in the mirror were too real, too vivid to be figments of their imagination. One night, Sarah woke from a nightmare, her heart pounding in her chest. She had dreamed of a man, his face obscured by shadows, standing in their living room, staring at her through the mirror. When she had gone to investigate, he was gone, but the mirror, it remained. That same morning, Mia woke up with a feeling of dread creeping along her spine. She had seen the man, too. But this time, it wasn't just in her dreams. He had been standing behind her while she ate breakfast, his reflection faint in the mirror, his eyes dark, his expression unreadable. The family was no longer sure what was real. Was the man in the mirror real, too? Or was the mirror showing them a glimpse of something far darker than they could understand? It wasn't just the reflections that had changed. The house itself felt different. The air grew heavier, colder. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Mia's nightmares worsened. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced she had seen something moving in the corners of her room, something that shouldn't be there. Then, one night, Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She had to know what was happening. She gathered the family around the mirror, desperate to find some explanation for the strange events. After hours of research, they uncovered the mirror's dark history. It had once belonged to a notorious occultist, a man named Victor Moreau, known for his dark rituals and forbidden practices. He had used the mirror in his ceremonies to summon spirits, to look into the future, and perhaps even to manipulate time itself. The mirror, it turned out, was more than just a reflection of reality. It was a doorway to something darker, a tool used to peer into realms beyond the living, where time and space didn't follow the rules. Victor Moreau had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of death and madness. But his mirror remained, carrying with it the echoes of the rituals he had performed. As the family dug deeper into the occultist's history, they learned that the mirror had not only shown them glimpses of the future, but had also trapped the spirits of those who had perished during Moreau's rituals. The figures they had seen, the man in the mirror, the faces of strangers, were not reflections at all. They were souls, forever bound to the glass. Each night, they grew stronger. The spirits began to reach out. Their presence felt more and more strongly. Strange figures wandered the halls of the house, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as though they were trapped in the mirror but could not entirely escape. One night, Sarah stood in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. But something was different. The reflection didn't match her. The woman in the glass was smiling, but it wasn't Sarah's smile. It was something darker, something twisted. As she reached out to touch the glass, the reflection moved first, as though it were alive, and Sarah's hand was pulled toward the mirror as if by an invisible force. She screamed, pulling back, but the mirror's surface rippled, as though the glass were liquid. Her heart raced as she stumbled backward, but the reflection of the figure in the glass was no longer just a reflection. It was reaching out, its hand pushing through the glass, its fingers stretching, pulling, as if it were trying to escape. The family ran, the mirror's presence suffocating them, the air thick with the whispers of the trapped spirits. They tried to burn the mirror, to destroy it, but no matter what they did, it refused to break. The mirror remained, its surface dark, reflecting only shadows and nightmare. The house was never the same. No matter how far they moved, no matter where they went, they felt the presence of the mirror following them. The spirits were no longer confined to the glass. They followed the family, haunting their every step, their every moment. And as for the mirror, it waited, silent and patient. The family had become part of its dark legacy, another chapter in the story of Victor Moreau's twisted rituals. And in the end, the mirror always finds its way back. The family's worst fears were becoming undeniable. The more they studied the mirror's history, the more they uncovered about its dark power that had been feeding off the lives of those who dared to peer into it for too long. The mirror didn't simply show reflections or glimpses of the future. It trapped souls. Those who gazed too deeply into its depths were absorbed, their souls becoming part of the mirror's twisted collection. It was a chilling discovery. The family realized they weren't just living with an object that showed them things. It was an object that took them. It took their essence, their life force, and twisted it into something dark and suffocating. The first signs of possession were subtle, almost imperceptible. Sarah noticed it when she caught her husband, Mark, standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection for longer than usual. His expression was vacant, his eyes unfocused, as though he wasn't really there. She called his name, and he snapped out of it, blinking as if coming back from a trance. He mumbled an apology, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Days later, Mark began to act differently. He became more withdrawn, less present. He would sit for hours in the living room, staring at the mirror, lost in thought. At times, he would talk to himself, his voice sounding distant and cold, as though he were speaking to someone or something that wasn't there. Mia, too, began to change. She started having vivid, terrifying dreams. Dreams of dark figures watching her from the mirror, whispering her name, calling her to join them. And in those dreams, she would see her own reflection move without her, its lips curling into a sinister smile. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave her. It lingered, hanging over her like a dark cloud. One night, it became impossible to ignore any longer. Mark stood in front of the mirror, his face pale, his eyes empty. Mia, desperate and scared, approached him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His reflection in the mirror was not his own. It was as though the figure in the glass was someone else, someone darker, more sinister. His reflection smiled, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Mia screamed for her mother, but when Sarah rushed into the room, she froze. Mark's body was still there, but his soul, his essence, had already begun to slip away. The mirror had claimed him. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moved across the glass, its form twisting and contorting as if it were alive, feeding off Mark's life force. His reflection no longer held his familiar features. Instead, it became a hollow vessel, a thing of darkness, staring at them with a malevolent grin. "Mark!" Sarah cried, shaking him, but he didn't respond. His body felt cold, lifeless. His eyes were blank, empty holes where his soul had once been. They tried to pull him away from the mirror, but it was too late. The mirror had taken root in his mind, in his very being. Mark's voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer his own. It was low, guttural, a distorted echo of the man he had once been. "We're all part of it now," he said, his voice strange and cold. "The mirror doesn't let go. It never lets go." Mia and Sarah backed away, their hearts pounding in terror as the reflection of Mark in the mirror began to move on its own, its hands reaching out toward them, as if trying to drag them in. But it wasn't just Mark. The mirror had been feeding off them all, pulling their souls into its dark grasp, one by one. The longer they stayed in its presence, the more it would consume them, until there was nothing left but hollow, empty vessels. In a panic, they tried to burn the mirror, shatter it, destroy it in any way they could. But the mirror resisted. No matter how hard they tried, it refused to break. The glass remained unscathed, an impenetrable surface, as if mocking their efforts. The spirits trapped inside the mirror, the souls of those long lost, stirred, growing stronger, feeding off the desperation of the living. Mark's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and he began to laugh, low, eerie, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. His laugh echoed in the house, reverberating off the walls as if the mirror itself were laughing along with him. "You can't escape," he hissed, his voice now a distorted blend of his own and something far darker. "None of us ever do. You're mine now, all of you." And then, as if controlled by the mirror's dark power, Mark's body moved toward them, his steps slow and deliberate, like a puppet on strings. Mia tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The air grew thick with a cold, suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. With one final, chilling laugh, Mark reached out to grab his wife and daughter. His fingers were ice cold, his grip like iron as he pulled them into the mirror's reflection. They fought, but it was futile. The mirror had them. The last thing they heard before the glass swallowed them whole was Mark's voice, but it wasn't his anymore. It was a chorus of voices, all bound to the mirror, all trapped within its depths. As the reflection of their faces twisted into something unrecognizable, Sarah and Mia realized the truth. They were now part of the mirror's curse, and the mirror would never let them go. Sarah, Mia, and even Mark, though his soul was no longer his own, fought against the mirror with everything they had left. They could feel the power of the glass wrapping around them, tightening like a vice with each passing second. They tried to destroy it, to burn it, to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. But no matter what they did, the mirror refused to break. It resisted, its surface shimmering with an unnatural gleam, as if mocking their every attempt. They set fire to the edges of the frame, watching the flames lick at the wood, but it was as if the mirror itself wasn't concerned. It didn't burn. The fire grew wild, consuming everything in its path, but the mirror remained untouched, cold and intact. Then, in a final, desperate attempt, Sarah grabbed a heavy object, a statue, and hurled it at the mirror, hoping to shatter its glass once and for all. The moment it struck, the mirror did something it hadn't done before. It cracked. But instead of shattering, the crack sealed itself almost instantly, as if the mirror was healing itself, restoring its deadly power. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the house, extinguishing the flames and sending a chill down their spines. The mirror was now more than just an object. It had become alive in a way they could no longer understand. The whispers grew louder, their voices mixing with the eerie laughter of the spirits trapped inside. The faces in the glass twisted, some contorted in agony, others in twisted joy, and Sarah realized the horrifying truth. There would be no escaping this nightmare. No matter how hard they tried, the mirror would never let them go. In the dead of night, when the house was silent, and every soul trapped in the mirror had resigned itself to the inescapable truth, the family made a choice. They could try to live with it, try to find a way to break free, or they could leave. But even as they packed their things, the mirror watched them. It knew they were leaving. Before they could make their escape, the mirror vanished. It wasn't gone, no, it was simply waiting. As they turned toward the door, the reflection of their own terrified faces flickered in the glass, and Sarah froze. It had returned to its original place. The family tried to move on, but the mirror had already claimed them. It followed them, haunting them from the shadows, leaving a mark on their very souls. They were never free, and then, just when they thought they had escaped, they received a letter from a family they had never met. The letter spoke of an antique mirror that had been sold to them, an heirloom passed down through generations. The same mirror, the one that had once belonged to them, the one that had taken their souls. The family had no choice but to accept the truth. The mirror was still out there, waiting for new victims. It would never stop. It would never let anyone go. The story would repeat again and again, because the mirror had a hunger that could never be satisfied. And so, the mirror was sold to another unsuspecting family.